Nebraska Pork Producers, AFAN, and the Nebraska Department of Ag, who are our title sponsors as well. And with that, are a lot of conversation in the last hour over our direct-to-consumer marketing and consumer trends, and I think that's a perfect segue into our final segment of the day. And with that, we have Carrie Horazeck on the call with us here today. Carrie is an innovation and foresight consultant. She is currently employed with the Engler program here at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. She has a consulting background and has spent time consulting for Fortune 500 companies, particularly around consumer trends. And she's going to visit with us about marketing, or about Generation Z and consumer trends in this new era. So with that, I'll turn the program over to Carrie this afternoon.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for that introduction, Will. Can you all hear me okay? Please let me know if there are any trouble. I am fully aware that I am the closing speaker for today, and you all have, I'm sure, been on your computers for quite a long time, so I will do my best to be as engaging as possible over the next hour. I'm going to aim to get through my content today in about 45 minutes, and then hopefully leave about 15 minutes for questions. I should also just let everybody know I am the mother of a 13-month-old, and I'm working on about my 11th head cold that she's bringing home from daycare. So I do sound a little bit raspy today, but thank you for bearing with me. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. I've got a little bit of a presentation to take you all through today. And then, as I mentioned, I'll just ask you to reserve questions for the end, and then we will have hopefully about 15 minutes for questions today. So as I mentioned, my name is Carrie Horazeck. I'm here to talk to you all today about understanding Generation Z's impact on pork consumption in the United States. I know that you all have talked extensively today about the production side, and I've just been listening into some of the amazing panelists discuss some of the just really incredible ways for doing direct-to-consumer marketing, production, transparency. We're going to touch a little bit on all of that today. But one of the things I think that's really come through as an overarching theme is that there are many different forces right now that are shaping the future of this industry in the United States. And I'd like to close us off a little bit today by talking about the future of the consumer market, and perhaps provide a little bit of a different angle from what some of our other panelists have brought to us today. And specifically, I'd like to spend some time focusing on Generation Z. Now, I am going to touch a little bit on some of the other generations and how they have impacted the overall food landscape in the United States. We'll talk a little bit about why generational insights matter, how they're different from age, life stage, and some of the other demographic factors that impact the marketplace. And then we'll dive specifically into this generation. I am going to divert from the pork industry for a little bit, and then I'll bring it back around at the end and then open it up for questions. Just a little bit of background on myself. As well said, my name is Carrie. I'm a former associate director at the Futures Practice at Kantar Consulting, which is a former division of WPP. I've worked with Fortune 500 companies doing innovation and foresight consultancy for the last 9+ years. And I'm very excited right now to be working directly with the Dean's Office and the University of Nebraska Extension, as well as teaching some courses here on innovation and foresight. I've been living in Nebraska now for about a year. I am a native of Central Virginia, Tucker Family Farms, if any of you all have ever heard of it. We host an annual spring professional female replacement sales. So my background is in beef. My dad still runs the farm today. My husband and I consider ourselves millennial foodies. We dressed our daughter up as a lobster for Halloween, and we were chefs. So it's probably about the most millennial thing you can think of, but we thought it was cute. So that's me, that's who I am. And with that, I'm just going to go ahead and dive right in. So as I mentioned, we're really going to kick off today talking about how will the rise of Generation Z in the market impact consumer preferences for pork. And I would like to start off by doing a quick primer on generations. And for those of you that have never really been exposed to generational insights before, I'd like to just start off with this photo and let you all look at it for a second. Now, this is an artist's depiction of the 1930s of what he envisioned, the artist that drew this picture, the year 2000 would look like. And when I show this picture to my students, I ask them a simple question, what did he get right? And oftentimes people will point out several economic pieces, right? There's this huge kind of booming city back here, public transportation, high-powered streetlights, the kind of suburban urban divide. And then I kind of ask, well, what did he get wrong? Some people will point out environmental factors, right? He might have been a little overly optimistic on this kind of huge forest here between the city and suburbia. But it quickly becomes apparent that one of the primary things that he got wrong was the social change, right? That you still see public transportation filled primarily with professional men, and then essentially women kind of waiting at the doors, kind of waving to their husbands to come home. And this is emblematic of how off your future calibration can be if you skip over the social change. So when we talk about macro forces in our operating environment, oftentimes we're very quick to dive into technological change, economic change, environmental change, political change, but we sometimes forget the social change. And social change in particular can have huge ramifications for our industry. And that's what we're really here to talk about today. So if you all sort of take only one thing away from my presentation, I would like you to remember this slide. Generation does not equal age and does not equal life stage. These are three very distinct things that have very distinct impact on your own experience in the marketplace and how you act as a consumer, as well as how you act as a producer. Age can best be characterized by this little comic from The Simpsons. If any of you do watch The Simpsons, it's just essentially how old you are, right? Kind of best encapsulated here by Grandpa Simpson, who says, you know, I used to be with it, but then they changed what it was. Now what I'm with isn't it, and what's it seems weird and scary to me. It will happen to you, which is kind of just a comical way of talking about trends, right? We can all think back to a time when we were sort of on trend, and now oftentimes when it comes to direct-to-consumer marketing, some of it can just be intimidating to us because we just don't fully understand everything that's out there today, and we don't really have the time or energy or personal interest in engaging with it on a consumer level. So what is life stage? Well, life stage is a little bit different. Specifically, it's the series of activities which presently occupy a cohort's time. And it's important to remember that different generations go through different life stages in their own unique way and at different ages. And just to give you two illustrations, this is a contrast of the young professional life stage of baby boomers in the 1980s versus millennials in the 2010s, both going through that kind of pre-kid, young professional life stage. As you can see, there's clearly very distinct cultural differences here between the baby boomer generation and the millennial generation. The millennial generation is considered the tattoo generation, and the appropriateness of tattoos in the workplace, you know, is a hotly debated topic, but it is something that really differentiates the generation's experience in the professional life stage. Here is another one. I, like, you know, many young kids here in the US, grew up watching Disney movies, and the youth life stage for me growing up in the 90s was really captured by films that looked like this, right? What we would kind of call the millennial Disney princess phenomenon. For Generation Z, I will show you that these are in fact the specific princesses that they grew up with. And I will essentially say, so what is something that is missing? Well, specifically the prince, right? So for Generation Z, you'll really see a much more specific focus on female empowerment, kind of individualism, and a story that doesn't necessarily follow that same rubric that you did see with millennials. So that's life stage. And then we come to generation. Generation can most basically be described as a series of formative events which occur in someone's youth, which bind them together in their worldview with others who experience the same event at the same point in their life. Now that might seem like a little bit of a marketing definition, so I will just give you a little bit of an example here. We can best think about generations by asking a very simple question. Where were you when? And what I'll do now is essentially just ask each of you all to think about that for a second. If there was one event that happened back in your youth that you think kind of defines a little bit of your personal upbringing, what would it be? And with that, I will dive into the generations. And I want to kick it off with baby boomers. I'm sure we do have some baby boomers on the call today. What was baby boomers? Where were you when moment? It was the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. Many were children at the time. My mother was one of them. Can very vividly remember where she was on that particular day. A couple of key facts about baby boomers. They were born between the 1946 and 1964, currently between the ages of 55 and 73. They have a spending power of $4.41 trillion in the marketplace today, still by far the largest spending power of any generation. And oftentimes I say, don't forget about the boomers, right? They're still very active in the marketplace, especially when it comes to meat consumption, and they have the spending power. So it's important that we continue to hold them in the marketplace as a key generational cohort of importance. Core values were individuality, self-absorption, and youth. And when I say self-absorption, I mean it, with all the love. The baby boomers in particular were known for redefining every life stage that they went through, right? So whether it was the college life stage or the young professional life stage or the family life stage, they completely redefined it and made it their own. And through that experience, they expected brands and entire industries to follow suit. It was the baby boomer generation, for example, that was responsible for the direct rise of the vodka boom in the 1980s, as they kind of eschewed brown liquors and really went for vodka as their key drink. There's 70.5 million baby boomers in the country today, about 22% of the population. They are not as diverse as younger generations that we see at about 72% non-Hispanic white. And more specifically, many of them do not plan to follow traditional retirement plans that many of their older family members did. In fact, 67% say they do not expect to retire at all. And this has created the phenomenon known as the boomer bridge job, very active retirement communities as baby boomers redefine the retirement life stage, just like they have every previous generation before. And that has really created a distinct impact on the marketplace. When it comes to the U.S. culinary environment, boomers are known for their meat consumption. In fact, Impossible Foods just recently did a study really looking into interest in plant-based foods, and I think the generational differences here are clear. Boomers are by far the generation who are most likely to say that they have never and will never try plant-based meats. In fact, 76% of baby boomers agree with the statement that meat is fundamentally a part of the American identity. And you can really see that reflected in several of their culinary norms. Some of the other culinary norms that boomers really brought to the table in the US was an acceptance of artificial flavors, in particular aspartame, margarine, and olestra, that we started to see in many different products that really sprung up around the time that boomers were in college. The beginning of mass convenience. Now, while mass convenience really started back in the 1930s before many boomers were born, you really saw it as an emblematic symbol of their childhood and that kind of first huge wave of women really going into the workforce and thus pushing for the necessity for mass convenience in food production across the United States. If you open up a boomer's cabinet today, this might be talking about yourself, you will see many spices that are really centered on the Eurocentric experience. Spices like tarragon, majoram, garlic and onion powder, paprika, spices that really define many of the pork dishes that we grew up with, right, and that we often know today. This is all a result of the boomer impact on the U.S. culinary environment. Our next generation is Generation X. They don't get a lot of love in the marketplace, so I'm going to try to give them some today. Generation X's where were you when moment was the Challenger explosion. If any of you thought that when I asked, good job, you got it right. Currently born between 1965 and 1978. Xers are currently between the ages of 41 and 54, which might be slightly older than you envision Xers being. And that is very important because it is currently the limelight time for Xers. As baby boomers begin to move into retirement, Generation X is stepping into the C-suite, which means they are now quickly approaching the top spending power generation in the United States. And that is not a position that Generation X is used to being in, right? They aren't, they're used to being kind of skipped over. They're used to being muted. All kinds of generational insights exist for baby boomers and millennials, but not so many for Generation X. It's going to be very interesting over the next few years to see how Generation X redefines the C-suite of major companies across the US, as they have fundamentally different core values than their former baby boomer bosses. In particular, Generation X's core values are savvy, diversity, and entrepreneurship. I do want to talk for a minute about this where were you when moment and why it was so key for Generation X. It was key because Generation X kind of came of age at a time when particular scientific advancement was really seen as the key center of progress in the United States. And we were in all kinds of international races to make it and really be prolific in space in particular. If you are Generation X, you might remember sitting in school and watching the day that the Challenger first took off, and the subsequent realization that such a program that had so much funding and so much money and so much patriotism behind it could essentially fall apart in midair, instilled in Xers an innate sense of skepticism. And this belief in particular was really driven forward by the divorce rate. As more and more baby boomers really began to prioritize their careers, oftentimes that translated to high levels of divorce for Xers parents. This has now translated to Xers as adults having a very keen sense of family. In fact, Xers are the most likely of any generation to say that they would pass up a promotion if it meant spending less time with their kids. So as I mentioned, as they're moving into the C-suite, it will be very interesting to see how this prioritization of family over the kind of workaholic syndrome really drives forward changes in the US kind of economic operating environment. 57.3 million Xers in the United States. They are a smaller generation, make up about 18% of the US population, moderately diverse, and as I mentioned, just kind of really instilled with that innate sense of skepticism. Now, the Xers' generational impact on the US culinary environment, as I mentioned, first one I would call frozen to convenient, because Xers are by definition nostalgia-holics. They have many, many brands that they remember from their childhood and their youth, and they love seeing brands from their past. There's a quote from a female Gen Xer from iconic communities that says, I love seeing things from my past. They make me feel warm and fuzzy and very young at heart. A lot of what you will see in terms of Xers' culinary imprint, now that they are in the C-suites and they do have more cash, is that same idea of convenient packaging with a focus on taste and a focus on fun and less kind of focus on preparation, but now illustrated in a little bit of a more sophisticated manner. So particularly for meat, you will see a heavy emphasis from Xers on kind of taste, how well something can be prepared, and then specifically what opportunities it affords for them to be able to communicate with their family. So things like cooking at home are going to be very key for Xers when they do have time. Even though they are in the C-suite now and have a little bit more cash to spend, Xers are loyal to a fault to a good deal. In fact, 88% of them join loyalty programs, whether it's at their local grocer, their telephone company, etc. Saving money is just an innate part of the Xer experience. Here's another quote. They may be at the peak of their careers, but Generation X still loves a good deal. Coupons, loyalty programs, and sales are all the highest ranking ways to attract attention with this cohort. So next, my generation, where were you when moment for the millennials? There's actually two for the millennial generation. If many of you are on the phone who are millennials, you might have guessed 9/11. That was my first guess as well. Certainly a very key formative event for the millennial generation. A good portion of millennials will also cite the election of President Barack Obama as a key formative moment, because millennials as a generation took a lot of direct responsibility for voter turnout in that particular presidential election. Just like with Xers, one key thing I want you to take away from millennials today is that we are no longer the generation of youth. We have houses, spouses, kids, and careers, and bad backs, and have fully made it into fully fledged adulthood. Currently between the ages of 23 and 40. Millennials turn 40 this year. Currently have a median disposable income of about $3.47 trillion. Millennial core values centered on authenticity, autonomy, and authorship. And I want to just pause on that authenticity moment for a second to really drive home that point. The reason that authenticity is so important to the millennial generation is because many of them had a golden childhood, which was Disney-like and very boomer-esque as a direct result of having baby boomers for parents. Many of them went to very prestigious schools, worked very hard to get straight A's, worked hard to be in all the sports teams to kind of build up that perfect college resume, and then just like myself, graduated sometime between 2008 and 2012 when all of that meant absolutely nothing. And as the economy completely crashed, they had to grow up very, very quickly and realize that many of the things that they thought were preparing them for the future world that they were going to thrive in weren't actually that useful anymore as the economy really began to redefine itself. That has instilled in millennials this very adult onset desire for grit and resiliency, and in specific authenticity. And millennials definitely translate that to the products that they look for. 80.3 million millennials in the US, currently making up about a quarter of the population. We would consider them a relatively diverse generation at about 55% non-Hispanic white. And they are also an incredibly adventurous generation. In fact, 52% of the generation says that they have a hunger for satisfying experiences. It's incredibly important in their personal lives. And oftentimes millennials get criticized for, traveling the world and eating avocado toast when they can't afford a house. And I will say that that's actually an intentional move on behalf of millennials, because they did enter the economy at a time where home ownership was just completely out of reach for many millennials. And being the children of baby boomers, many of them went on to say, I'm going to live for today. I am not going to completely put off all of my experiences for the future, because who knows what the future will bring. And instead, I'm going to refocus, focus a little bit more on renting as opposed to ownership, focus less on physical stuff and more on experiences. Now, the good news for the pork industry is that this has translated to millennials being the new foodies. Every millennial loves to eat, and has translated a lot of their love to the premiumization of everyday products. So a couple of key trends that millennials really drove forward in the food industry in particular was something we call convenience stewardship. So Blue Apron is an excellent example of this. And Blue Apron has been criticized for its excessive use of packaging. I think it's a fair criticism of the company. And that's why we call it convenience stewardship over outright stewardship, which is a difference you will see between millennials and Generation Z. Millennials do like to express core values. They specifically love to express core values if they can be seen to be doing it, right? So that's where that social media angle really comes in. Can I trace back the authenticity of your company? Can I align it with my core values, because I am someone that likes to vote with my wallet? Millennials are the generation that came of age as adults during the invention of the iPhone. So many of them do consider themselves very tech savvy. They are not native techies as Generation Z is. I definitely remember growing up with dial-up, but do consider myself, a very, very tech savvy person. They are the generation that has really spurred forth this idea of trackability apps, again, right? That idea of being able to trace all the way from the production of their meat all the way through to consumption at the grocer. Mainstream multicultural. Millennials really have driven forward that idea of multiculturalism into their culinary preferences. They are the generation that you're starting to now see the mainstreaming of things that have previously been found only in specialty food stores. So things like a mashup between Oreos and Mexican churros, or the Southeast Asian influence on the U.S. with the rise of red curry. We're seeing, Kettle One red curry potato chips, or the most prolific one I would say is savory yogurt. If savory yogurt had been introduced onto the U.S. culinary experience 20 years ago, it would have failed utterly. Not because it was a bad idea, but just because historically as Americans, we are used to thinking about yogurt as a sweet, as a breakfast food, right? It's something that we eat for breakfast, it's a sweet thing. as we started to see demographic shifts take place in the US, you're really starting to see the mainstreaming of some of these cultural preferences that come from areas like Latin America, Africa, and Southeast Asia. And savory yogurt is an excellent example of that. And then finally, foodie parenting. There are a lot of things that millennials are doing differently about their own parenting, which I could do a whole presentation on in and of itself. But one of them is foodie parenting. So really wanting to give their children a premium culinary experience, even if they can't afford other premium things in their lives. This is an example of a kids menu at Kirkland Tap and Trotter in Durham, North Carolina, where I used to live. And you will see that it's definitely not, spaghetti and fish and chips and a grilled cheese sandwich. It's very much got things like leeks on it, right? And kind of high premium vegetables and meats that you would normally consider to see only on an adult menu. So these are all things that the millennial generation in particular brought into the culinary mainstream. So if we smash those generations up against life stage, this is where each generation is currently at. Baby boomers are currently redefining retirement. Xers are reaching their peak earning years as they enter the C-suite. Millennials are entering parenthood and kind of middle management. And then we have Generation Z, who is our new generation of young adulthood, or the generation of youth. So we're just going to take a few minutes to talk about them. Who is Generation Z? Well, they are currently between the ages of 4 and 22, born between 1997 and 2015. There are 86 million of them in the United States, so a formidable force. I would encourage you not to ignore them or ignore them in your direct marketing strategy at your peril. They currently make up about 27% of the US population. And they are, many kind of census researchers and marketers like myself predicted to be the last majority non-Hispanic white generation in the United States. Generation Alpha, my daughter's generation, will be the first majority minority generation in the United States, where non-Hispanic whites will officially be in the minority. And the combination of African Americans, Hispanics, and Asian Americans will make up the majority of youth. Now, I say this, I'm about to show you guys a map where you're going to see that there's about 18 major urban centers in the United States where this majority minority reality is very much a reality today. It's not something that's coming in the future when it spreads across the whole US. It's very much here today, and it's already starting to have a very major impact on the culinary experience of this generation. So what are some of the starting points that are influencing Generation Z's worldview? Well, many of you may have members of Generation Z at home on your own operations, and you can probably be thinking about some of those starting points right now. I think one thing that we could all agree on is that Generation Z's kind of formative years have really been formed by disruption, right, to say the least. So these are just a couple of the newspaper headlines that really came to the fore during Generation Z's formative years, right? So we had a lot of recessions and recoveries, constant conflict, political polarization, unforeseen outcomes, technological revolution, etc., which I think you could really distill down into three kind of fundamental buckets: economic inequality, political division, and social distrust. And that's important to remember, because I think for many of us folks that are not in Generation Z, we kind of see this vanishing middle in the country as something that is in the process of happening, but that we can remember a time when it was not there. For Generation Z, the middle really has never been there, right? For the majority of the time that they can remember and have been cognitive, that middle really hasn't been present. Economic inequality, I'll just start with. In the 1980s, you really saw the kind of lower and middle classes see the largest jumps in income growth. This is what it looks like today, 2014 economic data. It has only gotten worse since 2014. It will be interesting to see what the next census data really does show us. Political division, I doubt I even have to show any of you all a graph to say that we are a politically divided nation at the moment. Even before our current president, up to 2016, we saw a very distinct rise in unfavorable views towards the opposite political party. And this has been a long-term trend. It's something that I point out with my students all the time, right? This did not start with President Trump. It did not start with President Obama. It started back early 2000s is when we really started to see a shift in thinking around politics in the country. And then social distrust. If we line the US up in the Edelman Trust Barometer compared to some of other key countries around the world, we really see that the US is in many ways going in the wrong direction in terms of social trust, whereas many other countries are heightening their social trust of private organizations, their own governments, news media. The US is going in the opposite direction with declining percentages of trust across all three of those major institutions. Parenting is really critical to understanding the future, especially when a generation is still in the youth life stage. As millennials were the children of baby boomers, Generation Z is primarily the children of Xers. And I would encourage you to remember that Xers are a skeptical generation, and they have imbued their children with a bit of healthy skepticism about the world. They've also imbued their children with a sense of a family first dynamic. Xers are very much more likely to raise their families as teams and to seek direct input from their children on the purchasing decisions of their household. But keep this in mind. Sometimes this generation is called Echo Xers. They're highly skeptical for their age, which in some cases is a positive thing, in some cases is kind of an unfortunate thing, but it does define the generation. This is just a little bit of consumer data showing you kids' influence over purchase decision by categories. And as you can see, especially when it comes to beverages, snacks, and restaurants, very high percentages of 12 to 17-year-olds currently saying that I have influence in my family's decision over what types of food we buy, where we go to eat, etc. So if you do have a Generation Z family member who is very passionate about something that impacts the food category, you can bet that that person is going to be translating that information to their parents, and they are going to be expecting their parents to live out those values in their own purchasing behavior for the family. So if anybody can guess, what is Generation Z's where were you when moment? Well, you know, they are still the generation of youth. In fact, this is still being very hotly debated. I can tell you when I ask this question in front of baby boomers, Generation X, and millennials, I get a lot of different types of answers. I have asked this question now in front of 7 different groups of students of Generation Zs, and they have 2 of 1 always given me the same answer. And that is active shooter drills in schools, that this is their defining moment. I would also argue just in the last few months that the second key where were you when moment for this generation is likely COVID-19 and the experience of school disruption and societal disruption that this disease has caused. Not only that, but I would say unlike the active shooter drills, which is very unique to Generation Z here in the United States, COVID-19 experiences are binding Generation Z together with members of their age group internationally, right? So this is really driving home that idea of a much more global generation that will have this globally shared experience that will impact their worldview and their consumer purchasing preferences moving forward for the rest of their lives. As a result of this, Generation Z is an incredibly digitally savvy generation. In fact, 45% of the generation was born after the invention of the iPhone. I just want you to let that sink in for a second. 45% of this generation has never known a world where there was not a high-speed computer in their pocket that they could access. How does that change how they think about information, how they think about access to information, how they problem solve, how they think about communication and discovery with other people? I'm just going to do a little bit of an illustration to illustrate that. So this is a picture of the Vatican in 2005 when Pope Benedict was made Pope. So your oldest Generation Z at that time would have been about 8 years old. What do you see here? Well, you see a lot of people standing around kind of waiting for the white smoke to come out. If you look closely, you can see a single cell phone down in the bottom left-hand corner, and the person isn't even using it as a camera phone. They're just using it as a regular phone. This is 8 years later at the election of Pope Francis, when your oldest Generation Zer would have been 16. Nothing but technology, right? Absolutely spanning everywhere. So this is the pace of technological change that happened for this generation between the age of 8 and the age of 16. very key formative years. For this generation, this is the pace of change that they are used to. It's very rapid, and who knows what the future might bring, but they know that, that this kind of accelerated pace of disruption is their normal, and they process it a lot differently than other generations do. This has instilled in Generation Z a very tech-focused future. 56% of the generation say it's very important to my parents that I excel in subjects like science, technology, and math. This has translated to a big bump in STEM interest amongst US high school students. And if any of you are looking for something to watch, while you are all stuck at home with your family, and if you have Netflix, I would highly encourage you to check out Lost in Space. It's, in my opinion, a very good depiction of a future world as viewed by Generation Z. It does a good job of incorporating Generation Z core values. So if you're looking to really understand how the generation thinks about the future, this would be a good one to kind of watch with your family. So I'll kind of sum this up with like 2 closing slides differentiating Generation Z from Millennials. If the Millennial approach, at least prior to 2008, was to say, I'm going to be kind of spontaneous and have more of a short-term view, I'm going to upend different life stages and try out different things and see what happens, but ultimately I'll figure it out as I go. For Generation Z, the stakes are just simply higher than that. There's too much global disruption. There's too much risk in the world right now. Generation Z's method is much more flexible, but also much more prepared. It's much more calculated, right? What do I want to do with my life? Well, I might go here, I might go here, I might go here, but no matter what happens, it's going to lead to these things, which means I'm going to have a solid plan. In other words, if millennials were raised to follow their dreams, Generation Z was raised to solve for X. There's a key difference between the 2 generations. So how does all of this really ultimately translate to the food environment and then ultimately back to us in the pork industry? Well, I just want to take a couple of closing minutes here to talk about the macro forces of change that are really impacting Generation Z's food preferences. The first one is climate change. And regardless of where you personally sit on this topic, I'm sure we have a huge diversity of opinion on it, and that's fabulous. It's important for us as producers to know that for Generation Z, climate change is an existential crisis. So whether it was Fridays for the Future or many of the things that you have seen on the news, 84% of this generation view themselves as the generation that will really have to come to terms with some of the major ramifications of our changing climate. And they see huge connections, right? So connections between, for example, climate change and global pandemics, or climate change and natural disasters. And regardless of where you personally sit, for them, it is incredibly important, and they will hold their own brands to account when they enter the marketplace. For this generation, the public sector is just simply too slow in controlling what they consider to be an existential crisis. And as a result, many of them are turning to the private sector to take responsibility for solving this problem. These are just a couple of examples of major things that have happened as Generation Z was coming of age in respect to the climate. Because of that, you see all kinds of environmental activism popping up through food, whether it's innovation around packaging, as you might see here, and just as an example of an innovative biodegradable packaging for fruits and vegetables that's currently in startup mode, or things like different breweries that are beginning to brew beer from the waste products of different restaurants, that types of thing. And ironically, a lot of these innovations that were set up to help from a Generation Z perspective deal with the environment actually became quite useful when we started dealing with COVID-19. We all of a sudden saw many breweries that started really turning out hand sanitizer, right, very quickly as a result of the bio waste that they had from setting up these operations beforehand. And for Generation Z, this would be obvious, right, because everything is all interconnected and everything impacts itself. The second major macro force is the demographic shifts. And I promised you all a map a few minutes ago of the United States. This is just some US Census Bureau data predicting 2044 as the year that the US is nationwide expected to reach majority minority status. However, there are 109 counties in the US already today where non-Hispanic white population has already fallen below 50%. One area where we really see that impact is in food, right? So really kind of see that coming to the fore in different types of flavor preferences. And I guarantee you that if you were to look at a spice cabinet of a millennial or a Generation Z consumer in particular, you will see things like sriracha, spices from Africa, spices from Asia, a lot of different types of spices than those Eurocentric spices that you would have seen in baby boomer cabinets. And it's not to say that Generation Z doesn't use those spices, but they have incorporated a lot of new types of spices where companies like McCormick are currently trying to figure out how to come to terms with this new generation. Finally, I just want to touch very briefly on the digital reality of Generation Z. As I mentioned, they are a digital learning community, right? Communication and technology for them is absolutely ubiquitous. So whether it was this group of high schoolers that, decided not to be defeated by having their prom canceled as a result of COVID-19 and instead just simply hold it online, to the rampant rise of TikTok, which is the video platform that Generation Z is using for social activism as well as just to share videos. I'm actually going to play you all a TikTok video real quick, which is a pork recipe from an Asian American Generation Z showing how to cook pork tonkatsu. I'm going to mute it because the music is a little bit grating, but I want you to pay attention to how fast this video is, and in particular, the visual nature of recipe development that Generation Z is utilizing. So that was a full recipe as illustrated in 47 seconds. That was not sped up. That is the normal pace at which these videos are often illustrated on TikTok, just to give you a little bit of an idea of how quickly the generation can process information in the digital landscape. So I'd like to leave you all today before I open it up for questions with just a couple of thought starters for Nebraska pork producers in particular when it comes to Generation Z. Number one, as Generation Z steps into the consumer limelight, how will their unique multicultural demographic makeup impact how and when they consume pork? So think about a reality brought up in a Hispanic household or an African household or a Asian American household, and how those recipes in particular will change how and when the community will consume pork, but also different members of Generation Z who have a lot of friends that they go to their houses that engage in these types of recipes, and how that in turn will change their view of the pork industry. Generation Z is spearheading the global climate movement. Is the industry really ready to meet this generation's consumer demands for environmental responsibility? And if you are, that is absolutely fantastic. I would encourage you to celebrate your story and to really get it out there in the digital landscape where the generation can see all of the good work that you are doing. But please do keep in mind that for this generation, this topic is an existential crisis, and it is something that they will bring with them as consumers to their own purchasing experience. For Generation Z, meat is an experiential, occasional event. It is not a daily consumptive habit. As we saw at that beginning chart with boomers and meat, Generation Z is much more likely to engage in plant-based foods. So how can you make the case to this generation to incorporate more pork into their diet, whether it's through flavor, through responsibility, through storytelling? How can you really kind of bring home to this generation that they should be consuming your product? And then finally, for Generation Z, technology is not a part of the world. Technology is the world. So how can you really position the industry to be transparent, accessible, and most importantly, shareable for consumers who will never know a pork producer in person? How can you still maintain that authentic feeling relationship, perhaps through a digital landscape, through packaging, or just through storytelling, that they can still feel like they truly understand your operation and they can be a part of it? And with that, I am going to turn it over for questions for a few minutes. I think I had one in the chat. If I can figure out how to get that And I'll first of all stop my share.
From Steve Roth wanting to know, do you think Generation Z will do less cooking and seek more prepared meals?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you for that. So, a couple of points to note on that. I would say in general, yes, because you are seeing a much higher percentage of Generation Z in urban environments where they're having much more smaller kitchens. Many of them are delaying kind of other life stages like marriage. So you'll see a lot more eating out, a lot more prepared meals, etc. All of that being said. I do want to keep in mind that COVID-19 is happening during formative years, right, for Generation Z. So if you've been following, for example, the sourdough bread making phenomenon that's been going on social media for the last few months, there has been a lot of recipe sharing and a lot of kind of DIY, do it your own for this generation in the last few months. So it will be interesting to see if that interest in kind of cooking at home carries forward outside of the pandemic and becomes kind of a formative experience for the generation.
One I had, Carrie, was obviously we're in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic, and do you see that having any impacts on consumer food purchasing trends? And if so, do you anticipate those to be long-lasting trends?
Yeah, that's another great question. I think a couple of points that I would make. One, as I mentioned, that this generation is incredibly tech savvy, especially when it comes to mobile, right? So for Generation Z, a tech first strategy is a mobile first strategy, and that makes them very good at e-commerce and e-ordering. I think you will only see that accelerate as a result of COVID-19, as many of them see now I have to make the case as to why I would go out as opposed to why wouldn't I go out if I can order my groceries online, if I can have food delivered to where I'm at. It's not only now an easier thing for me to do, but it might be more of a responsible thing for me to do for my health. So that's kind of a key issue with COVID-19 that I might see translate forward. The other one I would say, just from a macro forces perspective, is this generation is very attuned to the connections between climate and health. Right. So that's only going to accelerate as well in terms of the pressure that they will put on producers to demonstrate responsible practices that are protecting the consumer as well as kind of protecting the planet.
Thank you. We'll stay live here for another minute or two. If people want to ask questions, they can do so through the Q&A box here with Carrie. I encourage you to do so if you have any questions. I do have one that has been messaged to us, and it is: do you see meat consumption decreasing with Generation Z? And if so, what can producers do to help circumvent and reach to those consumers?
Yeah, I would say you're going to see meat consumption decreasing in certain demographics within Generation Z. And in some cases, it's going to be important to engage in that cultural shift because, again, Generation Z is eating more plant-based products. They are eating less meat. But at the same time, they are a much more diverse population. And in some of those key diversity cohorts, you're not seeing that decrease as much, right? So if you can really think about whether it's pushing for different recipes or celebrating different cultural nuances that drive forward experiences in, for example, Hispanic, Asian American types of dishes, where in particular pork consumption is still very prolific and very much celebrated. As those percentages rise within the generation, you're going to have those be your influencers. That will then in turn re-influence the mainstream kind of cohort to say, please engage in these recipes, engage in this consumption, because it's a celebration of our culture.
Absolutely. Do you have any advice on what producers should do to stay engaged and stay educated on consumer trends as Generation Z, as they advance and become more key purchasers in the market? How can producers stay in touch with them?
Sure, absolutely. I mean, I would say that the first and foremost thing is to talk to your kids, right? So many of them are in this generation, and many of them do, in fact, engage in lots of the things that might not be your cup of tea. You know, for me, TikTok is just not something I engage with. I'm officially too old for TikTok. But, I know it's important to the generation, right? So the more that I can understand it, then the more that I can engage with the generation. So things like, just keeping track of trends to the best of your ability, following a wide array of news sources about the generation, and making sure you're expanding your horizon and not just kind of focusing on one particular news source can be really key. And, you know, I would just following some of the trends that are important to this generation. So anything around climate, anything around cultural experiences, anything around technology shifts, and then just following some of those tried and true things that you also knew from millennials, right? Transparency, authenticity, storytelling, that those elements that we just talked about in the last panelist session, right? The more you can build that direct to consumer story about, you know, who you are and where you came from and what your farm's story and your production story is, will really resonate with this particular consumer.
Well, thank you for that, Carrie. And I don't see any other questions coming in. So I think we'll probably end the session here. But really appreciate your time, your insight on Generation Z, and you know, comparing it to some of the previous generations. So we want to thank you again for being part of the program. We enjoyed having you today.
No problem. Thank you, everybody.